Good afternoon, my totally radical monks, and welcome back to another tubular episode of Meditation with Vinyl. And today, if you couldn't tell by my backwards cap, we're taking it back all the way to 1994. And what way to celebrate that totally radical year than with the album that changed everything? And I'm of course talking about the totally tubularific, totally classic Dookie from Green Day. Dookie was released all the way back February 1st, 1994. And this year it celebrates its 30th anniversary. Wait, what year is it again? Well, pedantics aside, I have the baby blue version of the album for the 30th anniversary. And here I have it in the totally corporate Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inner sleeves. More on those in a later video. But here it is in all its glory. There's side one. Hopefully that blue showed up on the camera for you guys. It's a gorgeous light shade of blue. It doesn't really match the theme of the album, but it does kind of match the innocence of the 90s. And there's side two. And for all you vinyl heads out there, we'll give it a quick little side peek. It's not warped or anything, very flat. And this edition does come with a radical insert with all the lyrics on one side and a photo collage of the band on the other side. Look at Billy with those dreads. That's totally 90s right there, dude. So I actually picked this up last night at my local Walmart, which I know is totally corporate and shameful, man. But I cleaned it last night before I went to bed. I woke up this morning, put some laundry away, did some cleaning, and I put it on the turntable. And man, this is an impressive pressing. Right off the bat, when you put the needle on the turntable and Burnout comes on, it's like opening track right away shows why this album was so popular in 1994. And before I get into the album proper, I do want to share my backstory on how I got into Green Day. So it was high school. Right around 2009 or so, I lived in a new apartment. We had moved into a new apartment, and I started watching TV kind of on my own. Like, I had my own room finally. So I was actually able to watch TV, stuff that I wanted to watch. So I was poking through channels one day, and this is back when you still had analog channels. So you could hook up a TV right up through the analog output in your wall, and you could basically watch around like 50 or so channels. So I started watching VH1. They had this segment of top 10 videos, and at the time, 21 Guns was, I believe, number 2 or 3, if not number 1. And it stayed there for a good 3 or 4 weeks until it finally fell out of the rankings and they weren't showing it anymore. But I remember seeing 21 Guns, and that was at the time when 21st Century Breakdown, the album, had been announced. So I remember being enamored with that video. I love the video to 21 Guns. I love the song 21 Guns, even back then, and I love it now. That whole album is still one of my favorite Green Day albums, even though it does have a little bit of controversy in the Green Day fan base. I will always stick up for 21st Century Breakdown, and that was my gateway into the whole catalog of Green Day. And then right around 2012, I had already graduated high school. And I remember working in a game store for pizza and snacks and drinks. I wasn't working it all the time, but I was kind of just helping this guy out with his game store. And I remember he used to do a radio station on the side. And when the new trilogy, Uno, Dos, and Tres, were coming out, another controversial era of this band that I will hopefully get into one day. I don't have time for that right now. But when those came out, I remember listening to Nuclear Family, and I remember loving that track right off the bat. And I was helping him out with the radio station and introducing some of the tracks, and I got to introduce, I think it was Oh Love or Nuclear Family on the radio station. And this was just an online radio station, like on a computer. You could go and, play with settings or whatever. It wasn't anything big. But I remember having that be one of my most fondest memories of Green Day as a whole. And just listening to Uno and Dookie and Warning and Nimrod. And to this day, Nimrod is still my favorite Green Day record. I think that's the perfect Green Day record through and through. I love everything about it. But getting back to Dookie, I've really come to appreciate this album more over the years, especially as I get older. This is just a time capsule of the 90s. There's everything that was going on. And I was 1 year old when this album came out, so I didn't really get to experience the 90s. I mean, you gotta think by 2000, I was 6 years old. So the 90s kind of came and went for me. But when I put this album on, I can really get a sense of what was going on in that particular time period. Starting out with Burnout, Oh man, Burnout, putting this record on for the first time after cleaning it, the drums come in and Billy just says, I declare I don't care no more. Just that disenfranchisement, if that's even a word, and just the anger and the power of the drums and the guitar, and you can hear Mike's bass in the background, which right out the gate, this album satisfies. And then we get that epic breakdown towards the end of the track that really showcases Trey's drumming chops. I love that. And hearing that section on both of my speakers, how it's broken down and the stereo separation is just, chef's kiss. I have noticed with this pressing that there's a little bit of sibilance in Billy's vocals. It's not much, and I honestly don't think it really affects the sound of the record that much, just because, again, it's a 90s record, and it's supposed to be mixed kind of loud and hot, which it is kind of, this album is mixed very hot and loud, so the vocals do get a little bit buried in the mix, but that's kind of what you have to expect from a lot of these 90s pressings, because they were mixed to be on CD, which CD is just mixed way the hell up. So it's something you have to expect with these 90s albums, unless they get completely remixed. Like Vapor Trails from Rush, for example. They got completely remixed, so that doesn't really have that issue anymore. And the sibilance I kind of like, because it brings me back to those cartoons I used to watch as a kid. You know, all those 90s cartoons, like Dexter's Laboratory and Rugrats and Hey Arnold. You always had that one kid with a lisp and braces. Every single cartoon had that one kid. So when I hear the sibilance, I'm like, man, that's so 90s, dude. Having a Blast comes next. And again, this is a song that you probably couldn't write nowadays because it deals with a lot of, like, I don't know, like self-harm tendencies and just a lot of, like, dark topics that especially in a post 9/11 world, it's very much a touchy subject. But back in 1994, yeah, this was commonplace. And man, just the dark tone of the song and how Billy is singing with such just joie de vivre. Like, he doesn't care. The character in the song doesn't really care what happens to everybody else. He just wants his satisfaction. And the music really backs that up here. And one thing I love about this early era of Green Day is just Mike's bass playing. It's just so tasteful and so delicious. Like, you can almost like taste the bass licks. Like, they almost taste like cotton candy or like a candy cane, you know? Like, you could almost eat the bass licks, if that makes any sense. And then from Having a Blast, we sequence into Chump, track 3. And this track is a fantastic little look into someone who is jealous of someone's new boyfriend. And apparently that's actually something that Billy Joe actually faced. Him and his girlfriend broke up. She found a new boyfriend and he started to get jealous. So that jealousy is the basis of this song. And I love how we get a little peek into Billy Joe's psyche at this particular point in their career. And I think that's a huge selling point of this album as a whole, is you really get to hear the psyche of Billy Joe and everything that was going on with the band. And just you really get a feeling of how things were at that particular point. Not to mention, this track also has a fantastic breakdown that features, again, another excellent bass lick from Mike. And that sequences perfectly into the drum fill that turns into Longview, one of Green Day's most popular songs and music videos. I mean, you've seen the video. If you're old enough, or if you're a Green Day fan, you've seen the video. It's a classic. You got Billy Joe sitting on a couch in his basement, watching the TV. You got the dog throwing Dookie. You got the classic, like, flapper girls dancing. It's just a huge thing. And then the song explodes with that fantastic chorus, and it has the band playing in the video in that basement. And it's just a killer track, a killer single, and one that would really define this album and define this era of Green Day. And next we get another standout track, one of my personal favorites on here. And that track is, of course, Welcome to Paradise. Not the Kerplunk version, but the Dookie version. One thing I have to note is that this was the first album on Reprise Records, a major label, and they got Rob Cavallo to produce it. And Rob Cavallo, as a lot of Green Day fans know, would go on to produce a lot of their classic albums going forward. So this one, Insomniac, Nimrod, Warning, American Idiot. But Rob Cavallo just knows how to mix Green Day. Like, he has the perfect formula for production. This song details Billy Joe and the band living in like a halfway house in California, dealing with all the crime and death and just the atrocities of having to live out on your own just 3 weeks after you move out of your parents' house. I think a lot of kids in the 90s that grew up can relate to this song because they were kids back then, or teenagers back then, but a couple years later, they'd be doing the same thing, moving out and being on their own and facing the real world by themselves. And it's funny, the next song, Pulling Teeth, was actually my least favorite on here for many years because it wasn't fast and punky and aggressive like all the other songs on here. It always stood out to me as more of a Green Day does a darker version of a Beatles song to me. I definitely think this track is a standout on the record. It sounds different than anything else. And I think that's perfect being the 6th track. We're about halfway through the record, so they really mixed it up on this track. I've heard some people call Green Day the punk Beatles, and I will highly agree with that statement because they were really the godfathers of pop punk. They really started a movement that really wouldn't blossom until the late 90s, early 2000s. But these guys were really ahead of their time. And I think Pulling Teeth is the perfect example of that. I could totally picture John Lennon writing a song like this. Billy Joe was heavily influenced by bands like The Who and The Beatles and John Lennon's writing. And as you go further in Green Day's career, you can definitely see that Beatles influence grow more and more apparent. But this track here, Pulling Teeth, is all about a guy in an abusive relationship with a woman, and he's locked inside the room all day. He wants to get out of the relationship, but he can't, either physically or emotionally or mentally. And you really get a deep dive into the psyche. And what's interesting is that a lot of songs deal with abusive relationships on the woman's side, but this song details it from the male side. Billy Joe and the guys twisted on his head, and I think that's brilliant and ahead of its time for 1994. And there's a lot of other things in Billy's writing that really aged this record in a positive light that we're going to get into later on. And then to finish off side 1, we get the excellent single Basket Case. To start out the song, we have Billy Joe just strumming on his guitar, singing about anxiety. But after that, the song just explodes and we get Billy, Mike, and Trey just harmonizing together in an explosion of just musical brilliance. I love Mike's little bass note that happens right after the chorus, where the boom. It's just a small touch, but adds so much to the song. This track is really ahead of its time because in the 90s, we weren't really starting to deal with mental health issues yet. This was kind of the starting line of that. And it would become more of a pressing issue and something that people started to open their eyes and ears to in the early 2000s and going forward. Another thing about this record that really shines is Billy Joe's writing. Because you have to figure here, the songs aren't really complicated. It's really Trey and Mike that are holding up the rhythm. Billy's just playing strictly power chords and just mainly simple guitar hooks. But how Billy makes up for it, how he shines in the band, is his lyricism. So it all comes together like glued Dookie. And now flipping over the record to side 2, we get the fantastic single, She. Now this song was based off of a feminist poem that Billy Joe's ex-girlfriend had given to him to read. And he was so profound by the poem, he wrote a song about it and ended up on Dookie as She. And this is another track that's kind of ahead of its time, dealing with feminist issues and like a woman's role in life and really questioning those gender roles. And for 1994, sonically, this track is carried by Mike Dirt's excellent bass work. Like he is all over the fretboard on this track. Just the opening, do 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 do. Like it's just so earwormy. Just gets stuck in your head. And it breaks into that heavy breakdown section. Oh, this album is really good at its breakdown moments, the middle of the songs, when you really have the whole band combining their efforts into this amalgamation of like just powerful musicianship. Flowing right along to the next track, we get Sassafras Roots. Now this track Billy wrote about relationships. Some fans theorize that this track was called Sassafras Roots because of some of the lyrics like, oh, I'm a parasite wasting your time. So that details like a couple that aren't really great for each other if they're around each other for too long. The sassafras root is used to make root beer, but it can also alternatively be used as a poison that causes cancer So if you use that knowledge, that thinking, you could think, oh, well, this couple spends too much time together, so they're always fighting and it causes toxicity in the relationship. And now we're going to come around to the next track, When I Come Around. When I Come Around was yet another classic single from this era of Green Day and one of their well-known tracks, featuring a classic music video of them walking in a street and observing different scenarios in different people's houses. And I think this song overall is this album's ballad, or as close as this album gets to a ballad. It's kind of melancholy in spots, or melancholic in spots. It might be the most mature track on this album overall. Calling out Mike's bass work again. There's these little bass notes that you can hear throughout the song. Rob Cavallo knows how to mix and put in Mike's bass flourishes. That you can hear the bass throughout the whole album, but there's certain parts where it's elevated, so it just adds that much more playfulness and texture to each of the songs here. And I absolutely love when the track breaks down and we get that almost melancholic solo section that really encapsulates the whole entire song. I remember a couple songs ago when I was bringing up how well this album has aged on a lyrical level. Well, this next track, Coming Clean, is an excellent example of that. Billy Joe here is writing about coming out to his parents as being bisexual. And the song really details that. You really hear him struggling with coming out and, like the song says, coming clean to everybody. You gotta remember, this is 1994. This is before we really had Pride Month and all these other celebrations of the LGBTQ+. It wasn't even a plus yet. Think of it in that mind frame. What Billy Joe is doing here is so ahead of its time, but also so prevalent. Now we start to wind the album down a bit. The next track is called Eminius Sleepus. And now this may be confused as a Latin term, because it's pronounced somewhat in a Latin sort of way, but it's actually translating loosely as sleeping with the enemy. Now I think this track kind of gets lost in the overall track listing of Dookie because it is so deep in the rest of the record, and it's not a single. It's more one of the deep cuts on here, but it's actually one of my favorites. It has a great riff to it. I love the lyrical content again about jealous lovers, and overall just a great song that flows into the next one, In the End. In the End was written about Billy Joe's mother, who had started to date multiple guys that weren't good for her after his father had passed. So whenever the inevitable breakup would happen, his mother would end up turning to him for emotional support. And I love the opening lines of this track. All brawn and no brains and all those nice things, and you finally got what you want. Someone to look good with and light your cigarette. Is this what you really want? Sonically, this is the most skate punk track on here. It's really fast and aggressive. It really shows the anxiety Billy Joe feels about this situation every time it happens. And I feel like it gets worse and worse every time it happens. This song would sort of start a trend going forward in Green Day albums. Every album going forward, for the most part, would have that one skate punk track that's really fast and aggressive. This track in particular is the shortest track on the album, clocking in at just under 2 minutes. And it's a perfect bridge between Eminius Sleepus and the final track on this album, FOD. This track in particular is a little deceitful at first, because you had Billy strumming a guitar very softly. It starts off very melodic and soft. Billy singing lyrics about nuking the bridge we torched 2,000 times before, and just getting rid of your past relationships and just ending it with people because you're done with their toxicity and you're done with just how much of a spiteful asshole people can be. And then after the first refrain, it explodes, sort of like Longview, into this mega, almost metal song, I dare say, with how aggressive it is. And after that final breakdown and chorus ends, we get one final word: goodbye. And it's droned out for a few seconds, and the instrumental just ends. And all's left is guitar feedback and animosity. But wait, we have one more song to cover. So before we click off the video, we gotta talk about the classic hidden track, All By Myself. This is a song that Mike actually sings. on acoustic guitar, no less. And what's this song about? Just being a creep. You know, just kind of sitting in your girlfriend's room alone while there's no one at home, being all by yourself. You know, it's about it. Nice little pretty jingle. Before the song starts, it's this cool kind of Spanish sounding intro, then it goes into the acoustic bit. It's kind of a throwaway, but it's a nice little track to kind of calm you down after the angsty power that is FOD. So instead of leaving you on an angry note, the album kind of leaves you on a somewhat hilarious, if not awkward note. So yeah, after all this rambling, what are my final thoughts on Green Day's Dookie 30 years later? It might surprise you how well this album actually holds up. Even sonically, it does sound like an album from 1994, but the production is almost ahead of its time. Like, this kind of production is what they would use going forward with pop punk, like Blink-182, later Offspring, Simple Plan, all these, Sum 41, all these bands that I love, with the exception of Simple Plan, but all these bands that I love would take the template that this album laid out. If you haven't heard this record before, I implore you to give it a listen. You can listen to the 30th anniversary edition, which has bonus tracks, outtakes, live concerts. I recommend the live concert from 1994, both visually and sonically. It's a blast. No pun intended. And that's a wrap on my review of Dookie by Green Day. If you can, give the video a like. It really helps out the channel. Swing on over to that subscribe button to join our musical monk family. And make sure you hit that notification bell so you'll be notified when I upload a new video to the channel. Listen to Rush. And for all my fellow monks out there, don't forget to keep meditating with vinyl.